Give it to your brother. He needs it more than you do. You can just find another place to live." My mother's words echoed through the small living room of the modest house I'd just inherited from my late aunt, her voice sharp and demanding as always. My father stood beside her with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement, while my younger brother Derek stood behind them with a smug expression on his face that made my blood boil. They'd shown up at my door unannounced just 3 days after Aunt Marie's funeral, not to offer condolences or support, but to make demands on property that wasn't theirs to claim. My name is Emma, and I'm 31 years old. The house we were standing in represented the first stable thing I'd had in over 2 years, and they wanted to take it away from me just like they'd taken away my dignity, my sense of security, and my belief that family would always have your back when times got hard. But to understand why this moment felt like the final betrayal in a long series of betrayals, I need to take you back to where this story really began. 2 years ago, I lost my job as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising firm in downtown Portland. It wasn't my fault. The company had lost their 3 biggest clients in the same quarter due to the CEO's terrible business decisions, and they had to do massive layoffs to stay afloat. I was one of 35 employees let go on the same terrible day. All of us called into individual meetings and handed severance packages that were far less generous than what we'd been promised in our contracts. My severance was supposed to last me about 3 months if I was careful with spending, giving me time to find another position in my field. But the job market was absolutely brutal. I sent out over 200 resumes in those first 3 months, customizing each cover letter, networking on LinkedIn, reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts, attending virtual job fairs and in-person networking events. I got maybe 15 interviews total, and none of them resulted in offers. The companies were either looking for someone with more specific experience, or they went with internal candidates, or they suddenly implemented hiring freezes due to economic uncertainty. My savings dwindled rapidly as I paid rent, utilities, car insurance, student loans, and basic living expenses. By month 4, I was in serious financial trouble. My landlord had been patient for 1 month of late rent, but by the 2nd month, he made it clear that patience had limits. I was facing eviction. My credit cards were maxed out. I'd sold everything of value I owned. My laptop, my jewelry, my designer clothes from when I actually had disposable income, even my furniture. I was desperate and terrified. That's when I made the decision to reach out to my parents for help. It wasn't an easy decision. My relationship with them had always been complicated and strained. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one, the one who got good grades and followed the rules, while my younger brother Derek was the golden child who could do no wrong in their eyes despite being irresponsible and entitled. When Derek crashed his car in high school while driving drunk, they bought him a new one. When I asked if they could help with my college tuition, they said I should take out loans because it would teach me responsibility. When Derek dropped out of college after 2 years to pursue his dream of becoming a professional gamer, they supported him financially. When I graduated with honors and got my first real job, they barely acknowledged it. But they were my parents, and I was desperate. Surely they would help their daughter in a genuine crisis. Surely blood meant something when I really needed them. I drove to their house on a rainy Saturday afternoon, my stomach churning with anxiety and dread. They lived in a nice suburban home in Beaverton that they'd owned for 20 years, a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement and a 2-car garage. Derek still lived there in the basement at age 27, rent-free, while contributing nothing to household expenses and spending his days gaming and working part-time at a pizza place a few hours a week. I knocked on the door, and my mother answered with a surprised expression that quickly turned to annoyance. "Emma, what are you doing here? You should have called first," she said without inviting me in. "I need to talk to you and Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It's important. Can I come in?" She reluctantly stepped aside, and I entered the home I'd grown up in, but hadn't visited in over a year because I'd gotten tired of feeling like an outsider in my own family. My father was in the living room watching a football game, and Derek was sprawled on the couch next to him with his phone, probably scrolling through social media or gaming forums. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before my father finally acknowledged me. "What's this about?" he asked without taking his eyes off the television screen. "We're watching the game." I took a deep breath and explained my situation as clearly and honestly as I could. I told them about losing my job through no fault of my own, about the brutal job market and my unsuccessful search for employment, about burning through my savings and maxing out my credit cards, about facing eviction from my apartment within the next 2 weeks. I explained that I just needed some temporary help, a place to stay for maybe a couple of months while I continued my job search and got back on my feet financially. I wasn't asking for money, just a roof over my head in their spare bedroom until I could stabilize my situation. The silence that followed my explanation was deafening and heavy with judgment. My mother was the first to speak, her tone cold and dismissive in a way that shouldn't have surprised me, but still hurt deeply. "Emma, you're 30 years old," she said, as if that explained everything. "You should have had better savings. You should have been more careful with your money. You should have had a backup plan for emergencies like this. This is what happens when you don't plan properly for the future." I felt my face flush with anger and hurt. "I did have savings," I protested. 6 months' worth like all the financial experts recommend. But unemployment dragged on longer than expected, and the job market is terrible right now. Your father and I have worked hard to maintain our lifestyle," she interrupted. "We can't just take in every family member who makes poor financial decisions. You need to figure this out on your own like an adult." I turned to my father desperately, hoping he might be more sympathetic. "Dad, please, I'm not asking for money or long-term support. Just a temporary place to stay while I find work. 2 months, maybe 3 at most. I'll help around the house. I'll contribute however I can." "We don't have room," he said flatly, his eyes still on the television. "The spare bedroom is being used for storage." "But Derek lives here," I said, my voice rising slightly with frustration and disbelief. "He's 27 and pays nothing in rent. How is that different?" "Derek contributes to this household," my mother said defensively, which was an absolute lie, and we all knew it. "And he's going through a difficult time finding his path in life. He needs support and understanding right now." "And I don't?" I asked, tears starting to form in my eyes despite my efforts to hold them back. "I lost my job through circumstances beyond my control. I've been trying desperately to find work. I'm about to be homeless. Doesn't that qualify as needing support? You made choices that led you here," my father said coldly. "You chose to move out and live on your own. You chose to work in an unstable industry. You chose not to have better financial planning. Now you need to deal with the consequences of those choices without dragging us into your problems." Derek finally looked up from his phone with that smug expression I'd always hated. "Maybe you should have been smarter with your money, sis," he said mockingly. "Some of us know how to manage our finances better. Maybe this will teach you some responsibility." I stared at him in disbelief. "You don't pay rent," I said slowly. "You don't have a real job. You've been living off Mom and Dad for years. How exactly are you managing finances?" "That's enough," my mother snapped. "Derek is family and he's welcome here. You, apparently, need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet without running home to Mommy and Daddy every time things get difficult. This is the first time I've ever asked you for help," I said, my voice breaking. "The first time in my entire life that I've needed anything from you. And you're turning me away." "We're not turning you away," my father said unconvincingly. "We're just not enabling your poor decision-making. There's a difference." I stood there for a long moment, looking at each of their faces. My mother's cold disapproval, my father's indifference, Derek's smug satisfaction. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who were supposed to be there when I needed them most, and they were rejecting me in my darkest hour while continuing to support my lazy, entitled brother, who contributed nothing to society. "Fine," I said quietly, wiping the tears from my cheeks. "I understand completely now. I understand exactly where I stand in this family. Don't be so dramatic," my mother said dismissively. "You'll figure something out. You always do. You're the responsible one, remember?" I left their house that day and never looked back, driving away with tears streaming down my face and no idea where I was going to go or what I was going to do. I had 2 weeks before eviction. Almost no money, no job prospects, and a family that had made it crystal clear they wouldn't help me. The next 2 weeks were a blur of panic and desperate measures. I managed to find a buyer for my car, an older Honda Civic that wasn't worth much, but gave me enough cash to buy something that would at least provide shelter. I found an old conversion van on Craigslist being sold by a retired couple for $1,500. It had some basic amenities like a small bed platform and storage, and it would keep me off the streets. I used the remaining money from the car sale to buy some essential supplies: a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, some non-perishable food, a gym membership so I'd have access to showers, and a cheap phone plan so I could continue my job search. I moved into that van the day before I would have been forcibly evicted from my apartment. I packed my remaining possessions, clothes, documents, a few sentimental items, into boxes and bags that filled the back of the van. I found a spot in a Walmart parking lot where overnight parking was allowed, and I spent my first night living in a vehicle, crying myself to sleep while wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. Living in a van was harder than I'd ever imagined. The Portland weather was unpredictable, cold and rainy for much of the year, occasionally hot in summer. I had to plan my days around where I could park safely, where I could use bathrooms, where I could charge my phone and laptop that I'd bought cheap and used so I could continue job hunting. I showered at the gym every morning, did my best to maintain a professional appearance despite my circumstances, and continued sending out resumes and going to interviews when I managed to get them. But job searching while homeless was incredibly difficult. Employers would ask for my address, and I'd have to use a P.O. box and hope they didn't question it. I had to show up to interviews looking put together and professional despite living in a van and having limited access to laundry facilities. The constant stress and anxiety made it hard to present my best self. I was rejected over and over again, and each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of my former life. I tried reaching out to friends for help, but most of them were struggling financially themselves or couldn't offer more than temporary couch surfing arrangements that would only delay the inevitable. I applied for government assistance programs, but the waiting lists were long and the benefits minimal. I took on gig work when I could find it: food delivery, TaskRabbit jobs, anything that would bring in a few dollars here and there to survive. Months passed in this way. 6 months, 9 months, a year. I celebrated my 30th birthday alone in my van, eating a granola bar and wondering how I'd ended up here. I'd see families in their nice cars, people heading into their warm homes, and I'd feel this deep ache of loss for the life I used to have. I'd drive past my parents' house occasionally, seeing the lights on and knowing my brother was inside playing video games in his comfortable basement, while I was trying to figure out where I could safely park for the night. The shame was overwhelming at times. I'd been a successful professional with a degree, a career, a normal life. Now I was homeless, struggling to survive, wondering if I'd ever climb out of this hole. I battled depression and despair, some days barely finding the motivation to get out of the van and keep trying. But I kept going because what else could I do? Giving up wasn't an option, even when it felt like the easier path. Around the 1-year mark of living in my van, something finally shifted. I landed a job as an administrative assistant at a small law firm. It wasn't in my field. It paid considerably less than my previous position, but it was steady employment with benefits. I cried with relief when I got the offer call. It meant I could finally start rebuilding my life, slowly but surely. I kept living in the van for several more months while I saved every penny I could. The job stabilized my situation. I had income, structure, purpose again. I worked harder than I'd ever worked at anything, taking on extra projects, staying late, proving myself valuable. After 6 months, I was promoted to office manager with a small raise. After another 6 months, I was managing their client relations and had received another raise. I was climbing back, slowly but steadily. I'd been working at the firm for about 18 months and had saved up enough for a security deposit on a modest apartment when I received the phone call that changed everything. It was from a lawyer I didn't know, informing me that my Aunt Marie had passed away from a sudden heart attack at age 68. I was devastated. Aunt Marie had been one of the few family members who'd always been kind to me, though we'd unfortunately lost touch over the years as life got busy. But then the lawyer said something that shocked me completely. Aunt Marie had left me her house in her will. Her modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, completely paid off, now belonged to me. I couldn't believe it at first. I asked the lawyer to repeat himself several times. Why would she leave it to me instead of to my parents or other family members? The lawyer explained that Aunt Marie's will had been very specific. She'd left the house to me, her favorite niece, because she believed I deserved stability and a fresh start. Apparently, she'd heard somehow about my situation and had updated her will accordingly, though she'd never mentioned it to me before her sudden passing. The house was mine, Free and clear, no mortgage, just property taxes and maintenance. After nearly 2 years of living in a van, barely surviving, I was suddenly a homeowner. It felt like a miracle, like the universe had finally decided to throw me a lifeline after years of struggle. I cried for hours when I first walked through the house after the estate paperwork was processed. It was small but beautiful. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a cozy kitchen, a living room with hardwood floors, a small backyard. It needed some updating and repairs, but it was solid and it was mine. I could build a life here. I could finally have stability and security again. I moved in immediately, bringing my few possessions from the van that had been my home for so long. I slept on an air mattress that first night because I didn't have furniture yet, but I didn't care. I had walls around me, a roof over my head that wasn't metal and cramped, a bathroom with a real shower. I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in 2 years. I'd been living in the house for just 3 days when my parents and Derek showed up unannounced. I'd attended Aunt Marie's funeral, of course, but had kept my distance from my family there, saying polite hellos, but nothing more. I hadn't told them about the inheritance. I wanted to process it privately first and figure out my next steps without their input or judgment. But somehow they'd found out. Probably through other family members or the lawyer's office gossip, and now they were standing in my inherited living room, not offering condolences for my loss or expressing happiness for my good fortune, but making demands. Give it to your brother, my mother said again when I didn't immediately respond the first time. He needs it more than you do. You can just find another place to live. You've been managing on your own this long. I stared at her in absolute disbelief, my hands clenching into fists at my sides as rage built inside me. Managing? I repeated slowly. You think I've been managing? You have a job now, don't you? My father said dismissively. So clearly you're fine. Derek, on the other hand, needs a place of his own. He's ready to move out and start his adult life, but he can't afford rent anywhere. This house would be perfect for him. I looked at Derek, who was 28 now, and still had never lived independently, still had never paid rent, still had never held a steady full-time job in his entire adult life. He was standing there in expensive gaming merchandise clothing that my parents had probably bought for him, looking at my house with greedy eyes like he deserved it somehow. Are you serious right now? I asked, my voice shaking with barely controlled fury. You want me to give him this house that Aunt Marie specifically left to me in her will? Family helps family, my mother said with that self-righteous tone she used when she wanted to sound moral while doing something completely selfish. Aunt Marie wouldn't have wanted you to be selfish with family. She would have wanted you to share and help your brother. Aunt Marie left the house to me, not to Derek, not to you, I said firmly. She made that choice deliberately. If she'd wanted Derek to have it, she would have left it to him. That was clearly a mistake, my father interjected. She probably made that will years ago before Derek was ready for home ownership. If she'd known the current situation, she obviously would have made a different choice. The current situation? I laughed bitterly. You mean the situation where your 28-year-old son still lives in your basement playing video games while working part-time at a pizza place? That situation? Derek's face flushed red. I'm building my streaming career, he snapped defensively. It takes time to build a following and monetize content. I'm investing in my future. You've been investing in your future for 10 years with nothing to show for it, I shot back. Meanwhile, I lost my job, became homeless, lived in a van for nearly 2 years while you were living comfortably in Mom and Dad's house. And you all couldn't be bothered to help me when I begged you. That was your own fault for poor planning, my mother said coldly, repeating the same cruel judgment from 2 years ago. We told you then that you needed to handle your own problems like an adult. And now I am handling my own problems, I said, my voice rising. I survived homelessness. I found a job. I rebuilt my life. And Aunt Marie rewarded that perseverance by leaving me her house. This is mine, and I'm not giving it to anyone. You're being incredibly selfish, my father said with disgust in his voice. We raised you better than this. We taught you about family obligation and helping those in need. The hypocrisy was so stunning that I actually laughed out loud. You taught me about family obligation? I asked incredulously. Where was family obligation when I was living in a van and eating granola bars for dinner? Where was family obligation when I was showering at a gym because I had nowhere else to go? Where was family obligation when I came to you desperate and scared and you turned me away without a second thought? That's different, my mother insisted. That was about teaching you responsibility and not enabling bad behavior. But supporting Derek for a decade while he does nothing productive is somehow not enabling bad behavior? I challenged. Explain that logic to me. Derek has potential, she said defensively. He just needs time and support to find his way. You were always the strong one who could handle things on your own. So I was strong enough to be homeless, but Derek isn't strong enough to get a real job, I clarified. I was strong enough to be rejected and abandoned by my family, but Derek needs to be coddled and given a free house? Do you hear how insane that sounds? Watch your tone with your mother, my father warned. We didn't come here to be disrespected in this way. Then why did you come here? I asked bluntly. You haven't spoken to me in 2 years except to make it clear I wasn't welcome in your lives. Now you show up at the house I inherited and demand I give it to Derek? Why would I ever consider doing that? Because it's the right thing to do, my mother said, as if it were obvious. Derek deserves a chance at independent living. You've already proven you can survive on your own. You don't need this house as much as he does. I stood there looking at the three of them. My parents who'd abandoned me when I needed them most. My brother who'd never worked hard for anything in his life. They actually believed they had a right to this house, that they could waltz in here and take away the first stable thing I'd had in years. The entitlement was breathtaking. Get out, I said quietly but firmly. What? My mother looked shocked, as if she couldn't believe I was refusing them. Get out of my house, I repeated, louder this time. All of you, leave. Now, Emma, don't be ridiculous, my father started. This is my house. I interrupted him. Mine. Aunt Marie left it to me because she knew I needed it, and apparently because she knew what kind of people you really are. I'm not giving it to Derek. I'm not selling it and splitting the money. I'm not doing anything except asking you to leave immediately before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. You ungrateful? My mother started, but I cut her off. Ungrateful? I laughed harshly. What exactly should I be grateful for? For you kicking me out when I was desperate? For forcing me to live in a van for 2 years? For never once checking on me to see if I was alive or dead? Please enlighten me about what I should be grateful for. We gave you life, she said dramatically. We raised you, fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. And I've thanked you for that by being a responsible adult who never asked for anything until I was in genuine crisis. I countered. One time. I asked for help one time in my entire adult life, and you refused. Now you want me to hand over a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to my unemployed brother? The answer's no. The answer will always be no. You're making a mistake, my father said with a threatening undertone. Family is important. You're burning bridges that can't be rebuilt. You burned those bridges 2 years ago, I said coldly. I'm just finally accepting that they're gone. Now get out before I make this really ugly. Derek spoke up for the first time in a while, his voice whiny and petulant. This isn't fair. Why do you get a free house when I've been waiting for a break? You've been getting breaks your entire life, I said, looking directly at him. Free rent, free food, free car insurance, free everything while Mom and Dad paid for your existence. I worked 2 jobs in college to pay my tuition while you dropped out and they supported you anyway. I paid my own rent for years while you lived in their basement for free. The universe doesn't owe you anything, Derek. And neither do I. Aunt Marie barely even knew you, he protested. Why would she leave you her house? Maybe because she heard about what you all did to me, I suggested. Maybe because she knew I'd actually appreciate it and take care of it, instead of treating it like another thing I was entitled to. Maybe because she was a better judge of character than I ever gave her credit for. This isn't over, my mother said coldly, heading toward the door. We'll be talking to a lawyer about this. Aunt Marie clearly wasn't in her right mind when she made that will. She was old and confused. She was 68 and perfectly sharp until the day she died, I said. And her will was recently updated and legally sound. But please, waste your money on lawyers. It'll give you something to do besides enabling Derek's perpetual adolescence. They stormed out, slamming the door behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there in the sudden silence, shaking with adrenaline and emotion. I'd just cut off my entire immediate family, told them to leave and never come back, chosen myself and my own well-being over their demands and expectations for the first time in my life. And it felt incredible. Terrifying, but incredible. The next few weeks were difficult. They did actually consult with a lawyer about contesting the will, but the lawyer apparently told them they had no case whatsoever. Aunt Marie had been of sound mind. The will was properly executed, and I was the named beneficiary with clear language. They tried calling and texting me repeatedly, alternating between angry demands and guilt-tripping manipulation. I blocked all their numbers after the first few days. Other family members started reaching out, some supporting me and some criticizing me for being selfish and not helping my brother. The ones who criticized me were promptly informed about the full story. How I'd been homeless for 2 years while my family refused to help. How they'd only contacted me to demand I give away my inheritance. Most of them shut up pretty quickly after that. A few became genuinely supportive once they knew the truth. I focused on settling into my new home and rebuilding my life properly this time. I furnished the house slowly with secondhand finds and budget pieces, making it cozy and truly mine. I continued excelling at my job and received another promotion to Senior Client Relations Manager with a substantial raise. I started going to therapy to process the trauma of homelessness and family rejection. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during the worst times. I adopted a dog from a shelter, a sweet mixed breed named Luna, who'd also had a rough start in life. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had stability, security, a home that I owned, a job I was good at, a future that looked brighter than it had in years. I'd survived something that should have broken me, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. About 6 months after inheriting the house, I was in my backyard working in the small garden I'd started when I heard a knock at my front door. I almost didn't answer, worried it might be my family coming to make more demands, but curiosity got the better of me. It was my Aunt Marie's lawyer, the same one who'd handled the will and estate. He had an envelope for me, he explained, that he'd been instructed to deliver 6 months after the house transferred to my name. Aunt Marie had left specific instructions about the timing. Confused and intrigued, I took the envelope and invited him in. He declined, saying he'd just wanted to deliver it personally as Aunt Marie had requested. I thanked him and closed the door, staring at the envelope with my name written in Aunt Marie's distinctive handwriting. I sat down on my couch and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages written in that same careful handwriting, dated about 3 months before her death. Dearest Emma, the letter began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've now been living in my house for 6 months. I hope it's brought you some peace and stability after the difficult times I heard you've been going through. I want you to know that leaving you my house wasn't a random decision or a last-minute change. It was deliberate and carefully considered. About a year before my death, I ran into an old friend who works at the gym you were using. She recognized you and mentioned seeing you there often, always looking exhausted and stressed. When I asked about you, she hesitated, but eventually told me the truth, that you were living in your van in the parking lot, that you were clearly homeless but trying to maintain dignity and keep up appearances. I was devastated to hear this. I immediately called your mother to ask what had happened and why you weren't being helped. She told me you'd made poor choices and needed to learn responsibility, that you were fine and managing well on your own. But I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I did some digging, talked to some mutual acquaintances, pieced together the real story of how you'd lost your job and asked for help and been turned away. I was ashamed of my sister, your mother, and her husband. I was ashamed that I hadn't reached out to you sooner, hadn't maintained closer contact, hadn't been there when you needed family support. I wanted to help immediately, but I was already dealing with my own health issues, and I worried that direct intervention might make things worse with your parents, or that you might refuse help out of pride. So I made a different plan. I updated my will to leave you my house, and I added this letter to be delivered after you'd had time to settle in. I wanted you to know that someone in your family saw your struggle, recognized your strength, and wanted to give you a foundation to rebuild your life. You survived something that breaks many people. Emma, you maintained your dignity and your work ethic despite circumstances that would have crushed someone with less fortitude. You deserve this house and so much more. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting this gift, or for choosing your own well-being over people who failed you when you needed them most. Your parents will likely ask you to give this house to your brother. I know them well enough to predict that. Don't do it. Derek has been enabled his entire life, and giving him this house won't help him grow. It will just confirm his belief that things should be handed to him without effort. You earned this through survival and perseverance. This is yours. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed help. I'm sorry I didn't reach out more often or maintain a closer relationship, but I hope this house can be a new beginning, a foundation for the life you deserve to have. Live well, Emma. Be happy, and know that at least one person in your family saw you, valued you, and wanted to help you succeed. With love always. Aunt Marie. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Aunt Marie had known. She'd known everything, and she'd made sure I would be taken care of after she was gone. She'd seen my struggle when my own parents had turned their backs, and she'd done something meaningful to help me rebuild. I kept that letter in a frame on my bedroom wall, where I could see it every day. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, that someone had cared, that I deserved the stability and security I'd fought so hard to achieve. Whenever doubt crept in or guilt tried to make me question my decision to keep the house, I'd read Aunt Marie's words again and remember that I'd made the right choice. The months continued to pass, and my life continued to improve steadily. I was thriving at work and received another promotion to Director of Client Relations with a salary that finally allowed me to live comfortably without constant financial stress. I renovated parts of the house gradually, updated the kitchen with new appliances, refinished the hardwood floors, painted every room in colors I loved. I made the house truly mine, filled with furniture and decorations that reflected my personality and taste. I started dating again for the first time since before I'd lost my original job, meeting a kind man named Alex who worked as a teacher and understood struggle and resilience. We took things slowly, but there was potential there for something real and lasting. I was building the life I'd always wanted, piece by piece, on a foundation of hard-won stability. My parents and Derek continued trying to reach out periodically. Though I kept them blocked on all direct channels, they started sending messages through other family members, or leaving notes on my door, demanding to talk, insisting we needed to resolve our issues, claiming family was too important to throw away over a simple disagreement. They framed it as if I was being unreasonable, as if what had happened was just a minor misunderstanding rather than a fundamental betrayal. I ignored all of it. I'd learned the hard way that some people don't deserve access to your life, even if they're related by blood. Family isn't just about genetics. It's about who shows up for you, who supports you, who treats you with basic human decency when you're at your lowest point. My parents and Derek had failed that test spectacularly, and I had no interest in giving them another chance to hurt me. About a year after inheriting the house, I was contacted by a local news reporter who'd heard my story through a mutual connection and wanted to do a piece on homelessness and recovery. I was hesitant at first, not wanting my private struggle made public. But she convinced me that sharing my story might help other people who were going through similar situations feel less alone. It might also raise awareness about how many people are just one crisis away from homelessness, even those who seem to have survived together. I agreed to the interview with the condition that certain details would be changed to protect my privacy. The story ran as a feature piece about a local woman who'd overcome homelessness to become a homeowner and successful professional. It didn't use my real name or show my face clearly, but it told the essential truth of what I'd been through. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out through the news station with messages of support, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival, thanking me for speaking openly about something many people faced in silence. Several local organizations contacted me about speaking to their groups about resilience and recovery. I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, using my experience to help others navigate the systems and challenges I'd once faced myself. My life had meaning and purpose beyond just survival now. I was giving back, helping others, using my painful experience to create something positive in the world. It felt like redemption, like all that suffering hadn't been for nothing. But of course my family found out about the news story. Several people who knew them apparently saw it and recognized enough details to realize it was about me, even though names had been changed. They were furious that I'd shared our family business publicly, even in an anonymous way. They were embarrassed that people in the community now knew they'd turned away their homeless daughter while supporting their unemployed son. My mother showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, about a week after the story aired, banging on my door aggressively until I answered, just to stop the noise that was disturbing my neighbors. She looked older than I remembered, more worn down, but her expression was as cold and judgmental as ever. "How dare you? were her first words, not hello or any pretense of civility. How dare you tell the world that story and make us look like terrible parents? I didn't name you, I said calmly, though my heart was racing. I didn't use anyone's real names or identifying details. I just shared my own experience. Everyone knows it was about you, she hissed. Everyone knows we're the family who turned you away. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for us? People are judging us everywhere we go. Good, I said simply. Maybe you should be judged for your actions. Maybe you should feel some consequences for turning away your daughter when she was desperate and homeless. We did what we thought was right, she insisted. We were teaching you responsibility and independence. By forcing me to live in a van, I asked incredulously, by abandoning me when I needed help the most. That's your idea of good parenting? You're too old to be blaming your parents for your problems, she snapped. You're 32 years old. At some point, you need to take responsibility for your own life choices instead of playing the victim. I survived homelessness, I said firmly. I rebuilt my life from nothing. I am taking responsibility for my life. What I'm not doing is pretending that what you did was acceptable or forgiving. Just because you're embarrassed now that people know the truth. We want you to contact the news station and tell them the story was exaggerated, she demanded. Tell them your family did help you, but you were too proud to accept it. Tell them something that makes us look better. I laughed in her face. You want me to lie to protect your reputation? After everything you've done? Why would I ever do that? Because we're your family, she said, as if that explained everything. Because family protects each other. You weren't worried about protecting me when I was sleeping in a van, I pointed out. You weren't worried about family. Loyalty when you demanded I give my house to Derek. You only care about family when it benefits you or protects your image. This is exactly why people don't help entitled millennials, she said with disgust. You take any assistance and twist it into grievance. You make yourself the victim of every situation. We should have known better than to expect gratitude. I don't recall receiving any assistance to be grateful for, I said coldly. But I appreciate you reminding me exactly why I cut contact with you. It reinforces that I made the right decision. Derek needs help, she said, changing tactics suddenly. He's struggling. He's depressed. He needs support, and you have a whole house with an extra bedroom. The least you could do is let him move in temporarily while he gets on his feet. Absolutely not, I said without hesitation. Derek is a 30-year-old man who's never taken responsibility for his own life, because you've enabled him at every turn. He's not moving into my house under any circumstances. So you'll help strangers at that shelter, but you won't help your own brother? She asked accusingly. Those strangers at the shelter want help and are willing to work toward improving their situations, I explained. Derek wants a handout and expects everyone else to solve his problems for him. There's a difference. You've become so cold and selfish, my mother said, with what might have been genuine sadness in her voice. I don't even recognize you anymore. Good, I replied. The person you remember was desperate for your approval and willing to accept crumbs of affection while you gave Derek everything. That person died when she was living in a van and realized her family didn't actually care if she lived or died. The person I am now has self-respect and boundaries. If that seems cold to you, that's your problem, not mine. You're going to regret this, she warned. Someday when your father and I are gone, you're going to wish you'd valued family more while you had the chance. I already lost my family 2 years ago when I needed you most, I said. You've been dead to me for a long time. This conversation is just confirming what I already knew. She stared at me for a long moment, maybe finally realizing that I meant every word, that there was no manipulation or guilt trip that would work anymore. Then she turned and walked away without another word, getting into her car and driving off. I closed the door and leaned against it, shaking slightly but feeling stronger than I had in years. I'd stood my ground completely, refused to be manipulated, maintained my boundaries firmly. It felt powerful and right. That evening, I got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Derek. Apparently he'd gotten a new phone, or was borrowing someone else's to get around my blocking. The message was long and rambling, alternating between angry accusations and pathetic guilt trips. He called me selfish and heartless for not helping family. He claimed I was being cruel by keeping a house with extra space all to myself when he was still living in our parents' basement. He said Aunt Marie would be disappointed in how I was treating her gift. He reminded me that he was my brother, and that should mean something. He said I was lucky to have gotten a free house while he'd gotten nothing, and that wasn't fair. He demanded I either let him move in or give him money to help with his expenses since I was supposedly doing so well now. I read the entire message without responding, then blocked that number too. Nothing in that text suggested Derek had learned anything or changed at all. He was still entitled, still expecting others to solve his problems, still blaming everyone else for his situation instead of taking any personal responsibility. He was still the same person who'd smirked at me when our parents kicked me out, who'd mocked me for being homeless while living comfortably in their house rent-free. I felt no guilt about cutting him off. Some bridges need to burn so you can stop wasting energy trying to cross them. Life continued to move forward in positive directions. I got engaged to Alex after 2 years of dating, and we started planning a small wedding with close friends and chosen family. My career continued to flourish, and I was being considered for a vice president position at the firm. I was healthy, happy, financially stable, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me. The contrast between my current life and those years of struggle felt almost surreal. About 3 years after inheriting the house, I decided to sell it. Not because I didn't love it or appreciate what it represented, but because Alex and I wanted to buy a house together. Something that would be truly ours as we started our marriage. The housing market had improved significantly, and my modest inherited 2-bedroom house had appreciated considerably in value. I sold it for almost double what it had been worth when I'd inherited it, walking away with a substantial profit that would make an excellent down payment on the home Alex and I wanted to buy together. Aunt Marie's gift had done exactly what she'd intended. It had given me stability when I needed it most, and now it was helping me build the next chapter of my life. Of course, my parents somehow heard about the sale. They showed up at the house during the final walkthrough with the new buyers, causing a scene in front of the real estate agents and buyers by demanding to know why I was selling without offering it to Derek. First at a reduced price since we were family. The new buyers were, understandably disturbed by this confrontation. I apologized to them profusely, and had to explain briefly that these people were estranged family members who were trespassing and had no claim to the property. I called the police to have them removed from the premises, and they were escorted off while my mother screamed about what an ungrateful daughter I was, and my father threatened legal action they had no basis for. The sale still went through successfully despite the drama, but I was mortified that my family had tried to sabotage it. Their entitlement knew no bounds. Even years later, they still believed they had some right to control my life and my assets, that Derek's comfort and desires mattered, more than my own well-being and future. The police visit apparently shook something loose because a few days later I received a certified letter from my parents through their lawyer. It was a formal demand letter claiming I owed them reimbursement for 18 years of child-rearing expenses, since I'd allegedly abandoned the family and refused to maintain family relationships. They itemized everything from food costs to housing to clothes to education, coming up with an absurd figure of over $200,000 they claimed I owed them for the privilege of being raised as their child. I took the letter to my own lawyer, who laughed out loud when he read it. "This is absolutely ridiculous and has no legal standing whatsoever," he assured me. "Parents have a legal obligation to support their minor children. They can't retroactively bill you for fulfilling that obligation, especially not years later when you're an adult. This is just harassment." He sent a response letter explaining that their demand was legally baseless and that any further harassment would result in a restraining order and potential legal action for frivolous claims. That finally seemed to quiet them down, at least for a while. The letters and messages stopped, the drive-bys of my property ceased. The attempts to contact me through other family members ended. I hoped it was finally over, that they'd finally accepted reality and moved on with their lives, but I should have known better. Alex and I got married in a small ceremony with 30 guests, all carefully chosen friends and supportive family members. My parents and Derek were explicitly not invited, though I knew through the grapevine that they'd heard about the wedding and were furious about being excluded. I didn't care. This was my day, my celebration, my new beginning, and I wasn't going to let people who'd treated me terribly contaminate it with their presence. The wedding was beautiful and perfect. I married someone who valued me, respected me, supported my dreams, and treated me as an equal partner. We bought a lovely house together in a good neighborhood with room to grow into. We both had successful careers we were passionate about. We adopted another rescue dog to keep Luna company. We traveled. We laughed. We built a life filled with joy and mutual support. Everything my family had tried to convince me I didn't deserve, I now had. And I'd built it myself through resilience and hard work, not through handouts or enabling or refusing to grow up. About a year into my marriage, I received an unexpected message through LinkedIn from Derek. It was long and surprisingly self-aware, or at least it seemed that way initially. He apologized for how he'd treated me over the years, acknowledged that he'd been enabled and entitled, admitted that watching me succeed while he continued to struggle had forced him to confront some hard truths about himself. He said he'd finally moved out of our parents' house and was living with roommates, that he'd gotten a full-time job doing tech support and was working on becoming more independent and responsible. He said he'd started therapy to work through his issues and patterns. He said he hoped someday we might be able to have a relationship again, that he missed having a sister, that he regretted not standing up for me when our parents had treated me so poorly. The message seemed genuine, and I wanted to believe it represented real growth and change. But I was also wary after years of manipulation and disappointment. I showed it to Alex and my therapist, both of whom advised proceeding with extreme caution if I chose to respond at all. I thought about it for several days before deciding to send a brief response. I acknowledged his apology and told him I was glad to hear he was working on himself and becoming more independent. But I also made it clear that I wasn't ready to resume a relationship, that trust had been broken too severely, and would take a very long time to rebuild if it was even possible. I told him that actions over time would matter more than words in a message. He responded respectfully, saying he understood and would respect my boundaries. He asked if we could perhaps meet for coffee in 6 months or a year if I felt comfortable, just to talk face to face. I said maybe, that I'd think about it, but I made no promises. True to his word, Derek didn't push. He didn't send multiple follow-up messages or try to manipulate me into seeing him sooner. The months passed and I'd occasionally see updates about him through mutual connections. He was still working at his job, still living independently with roommates, still apparently making genuine efforts to improve his life. It was promising, but I remained cautiously skeptical. About 8 months after that initial message, Derek reached out again briefly to say he wanted to meet with me if I was willing, that he had something important to tell me and apologize for in person. Against my better judgment, but with curiosity getting the better of me, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in a public place with Alex coming along for support. Derek showed up looking different than I remembered, older, more mature, less arrogant in his demeanor. He thanked me for meeting with him and acknowledged how much courage it must have taken given our history. Then he proceeded to tell me something I hadn't expected to hear. Our parents had apparently been telling everyone in the family and their social circle for years that they'd helped me extensively when I was struggling, that they'd offered me money and housing and I'd refused out of pride, that they'd tried repeatedly to support me, but I'd pushed them away because I was too stubborn to accept help. They'd been playing the victim and rewriting history to make themselves look like caring parents whose ungrateful daughter had rejected their generosity. Derek admitted he'd believed this narrative for a long time and had repeated it himself to others, contributing to the family myth. But as he'd started therapy and examining his own life more honestly, he'd started questioning things. He'd asked our parents specific questions about when and how they'd offered help, what exactly they'd done to support me, and their answers had been vague and contradictory. Eventually, he'd confronted them directly, and they'd finally admitted the truth, that they hadn't helped at all, that they'd actually turned me away, that they'd been lying to save face and avoid judgment from others. Derek said learning this truth had been one of the catalysts for his decision to finally move out and start working on himself. He'd realized that if they could lie so completely about something that significant, what else had they lied about? What other narratives had they constructed to avoid accountability? He'd started seeing them more clearly and hadn't liked what he'd discovered. He apologized sincerely for believing and repeating their lies, for not questioning their version of events sooner, for not reaching out to me directly to hear my side of the story. He said he understood if I never wanted a relationship with him, but he wanted me to know that he now saw the truth and was trying to be better than he'd been raised to be. I sat there processing this information, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication that the truth was finally coming out, that at least one family member now acknowledged what had really happened. Sadness that it had taken this long and that the damage couldn't be undone. I told Derek I appreciated his honesty and his apology. I told him I was glad he was working on himself and breaking free from our parents' dysfunction. But I also told him that rebuilding trust would be a very slow process if it happened at all, that I needed to see consistent change over years, not months, that I wasn't making any promises about what our relationship might look like in the future. He said he understood completely and just asked if we could stay in occasional contact, maybe check in with each other every few months to see how we were doing. I agreed to that limited arrangement, keeping the door open just a crack while maintaining firm boundaries. Over the next couple of years, Derek and I did maintain occasional contact. We'd meet for coffee every few months, have brief text exchanges about life updates, gradually rebuild some small connection. He continued working at his job and eventually got promoted. He continued living independently and learning to manage his own life. He continued therapy and seemed genuinely committed to growth. He started dating someone healthy who challenged him to be better. I stayed cautious, but began to believe that maybe, possibly, he was actually changing for real this time. Maybe seeing the truth about our parents had given him the wake-up call he'd needed to finally mature and take responsibility for his own life. As for our parents, I maintained zero contact with them despite their occasional attempts to reach out. They sent cards for my birthday that I threw away unopened. They left voicemails I deleted without listening. They sent messages through Derek asking him to convince me to reconcile, which he refused to do, respecting my boundaries. Derek told me that his relationship with them had become strained and complex. He still saw them occasionally, but with clear boundaries now. He'd stopped accepting money from them and paid his own way entirely. He'd confronted them about their treatment of me and their lies, which they'd initially denied before finally admitting when pressed. They claimed they'd just been doing what they thought was best, that they'd been trying to teach me independence, that they hadn't realized how bad things had gotten for me. Derek didn't believe their excuses anymore, and neither did I. They'd made conscious choices to abandon their daughter in crisis while continuing to enable their son's dependency. No amount of rationalization could make that acceptable. My life continued flourishing without them in it. Alex and I celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary with a trip to Italy. I got promoted to vice president at the firm with a substantial salary increase and significant leadership responsibilities. We started seriously discussing having children and what kind of parents we wanted to be. Supportive, present, reliable, the opposite of how I'd been raised. Sometimes I'd think about those 2 years living in my van, about the desperation and fear and uncertainty I'd felt every single day. It felt like a different lifetime now, like something that had happened to someone else, but I knew it had shaped me fundamentally, taught me lessons about resilience and self-reliance, and who I could really count on when things got hard. I'd learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about who shows up consistently with love and support. I'd learned that you can survive things you think will destroy you. I'd learned that asking for help isn't weakness, but refusing to help someone in genuine need is cruelty. I'd learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose yourself, even when others tell you that's selfish. Aunt Marie's house had been so much more than just a building or an inheritance. It had been proof that someone saw my struggle and valued me enough to help when I needed it most. It had been a foundation to rebuild my life upon after years of instability. It had been a lesson in what real family support looks like, not control or judgment, but genuine care and practical help when it matters most. The house was gone now, sold and owned by another family making their own memories there. But what it had given me remained. Stability, hope, a second chance, proof that I deserved good things despite what my parents had tried to make me believe. I was 35 years old now, happily married, financially secure, successful in my career, surrounded by chosen family who actually cared about me. I'd gone from homeless and desperate to thriving and content, and I'd done it not because of my parents, but despite them. Not because of handouts, but through resilience and refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the easier path. Sometimes people who knew my story would ask if I regretted cutting off my parents, if I felt guilty about maintaining that boundary, if I worried about what would happen when they got older and needed care. The answer was simple. No regrets, no guilt, no worry about their future needs. They'd made their choices when I was at my most vulnerable. They'd chosen favoritism and judgment over compassion and support. They'd chosen to protect their own comfort over helping their daughter survive. Those choices had consequences, and one of those consequences was losing me permanently from their lives. I owed them nothing. Not my house, not my money, not my time, not my emotional energy, not my forgiveness. I'd given them 18 years of trying to earn their love and approval, and 2 years of desperate need they'd ignored. That account was closed and would never reopen. Derek was working on himself and trying to be better, and I respected that journey even if I maintained appropriate distance. Maybe someday we'd have a fuller relationship again, maybe not. Time would tell and I wasn't forcing anything, but my parents? They'd lost their daughter the day they turned her away from their door when she was homeless and begging for help. That was a choice they'd made freely, and they'd have to live with it for the rest of their lives, just as I'd had to live in a van because of their choice. I'd built a beautiful life from the ashes of my lowest point. I'd found love, success, happiness, peace. I'd become the kind of person Aunt Marie had believed I could be. Strong, resilient, kind, successful. Someone who helped others because I knew what it felt like to need help desperately, and I'd done it all without them. That was my victory, my vindication, my proof that their judgment of me had been wrong. I didn't need their validation or approval anymore. I had my own. Looking back now from the comfortable living room of the house I shared with my husband, with both dogs sleeping peacefully at my feet, with photo albums full of good memories and a future full of possibility, I could honestly say I'd won. Not because I was rich or successful or had a nice house, but because I'd survived, healed, thrived, and become someone I was genuinely proud to be. The girl who'd lived in a van had become a woman who owned her life completely, and no one could ever take that away from me.